Hey there, EliteLenny here with a message. First off, I want to thank you for grabbing the time to take a look at this. Like the video and subscribe to my channel to support me and help me make more content. I'm looking to have my channel grow too, so please go ahead and check out my Patreon and PayPal links at the description box. It'll be awesome if you become a patron, considering the trouble to getting content published these days. Though if you wish to, you can donate to help a guy out in this messy atmosphere of ours. Don't forget to also check out my streaming page on Twitch, where I showcase mostly gaming streams, though I may also put some chat streams in the equation. Without further ado, let's get to it, and let's have a good one.
Well, let's just say it. Putin is a real a-hole. They change completely when a regime dissolves it on itself. It's a completely different story. They didn't understand how the times should change for them. Of course, they were not prepared. That's something we cannot blame on them either. All these smokes, this is EliteLenny reporting for duty, and I am here. I am here today to actually react to a video called "Did NATO Really Betray Russia?" I am actually reacting to that video by Alternate History Hub, in which he talks about why Russia is actually invading Ukraine and what Putin's reasons are, and if they are actually valid. Well, to me, they are not valid because his dream for uniting all Russian people into one entire Russian empire is invalidated because of the times. Yes, like what Big Boss said, the times matter. Of course, everything changes by then, too. So, pretty much, the time of the Russian Empire is over. The time of the former USSR is over. So he still keeps being a loyalist, even if his old regime had already fallen, because of its continuous failures to sustain its people. Well, sustain its people and keep them either dead or unknowing of anything. Well, you have to blame that on Stalin because he had to break everything that is related to. He had to break anything that is related to Vladimir Lenin. Oh yeah, that's right, Lenin. Okay, I'm just thinking. Yeah, Lenin actually started that communist utopia thing. But then Stalin stole it from under Lenin's nose, the government, and then everything else that Lenin actually achieved, Stalin completely erased. And of course, everything related to Lenin's achievements has been mostly forgotten by the people of Russia. Mostly. Well, not everyone, of course. They wanted Lenin back in because he makes a more Soviet utopia, more Soviet-based utopia than Stalin would ever do. Because of what happened after Lenin's death, Stalin really took over and just made sure everyone who's actually working in agriculture that time worked in the industrial sector. That is horrible. Anyone who would say anything against the government of the USSR would either be persecuted or just... Yeah, you know what I mean. So definitely. And then everything changed after the USSR had actually crumbled to the ground. 1991. We'll see what happens first. Let's try to react to this. Definitely we're going to have to react to this.
Many might be wondering, how did it come to this? How, even after the USSR fell, did Russia go down such a different path than NATO? Was there ever perhaps some possibility that these two rivals after the end of the Cold War would have came together in peace? Because apparently Putin seems to think so.
Yeah, you have to actually think about it too. Is Putin actually the right person to actually lead this campaign? And at the same time, lead the country in general, of course. But I want to say this. Putin is really sick in the head. Really sick in the head because of his own loyalty. Sick in the head at the fact that, well, he thinks that Russia has been upended by Western superiority because of the acts of the West in getting every other nation that was former Soviet nation to align with NATO, because they don't want communism to spread than how it already is with China. China has always been a communist country. And unfortunately, they've been under scrutiny ever since Tiananmen Square. Yeah, pretty much. Hold on, I'm just adjusting the display, so be right back. Well, let's just say it. Putin is a real a-hole. From the beginning of when he sat. Really. Let's just continue. Or
at least, he says so. His current track record with the truth isn't the best, by the way.
Yeah.
You really think someone would do that?
Putin says Russia wanted to join NATO, but NATO didn't let them. Is there truth to this?
It's only a half-truth. The agreement, well, the verbal agreement was made during the time of the USSR. It was invalidated after the USSR had dissolved. So there's a completely different conversation to take place if ever the Russian Federation would actually join NATO by that point. But there was no conversation.
What do you mean,
The answer to why Russia didn't join NATO is a story about a former superpower rebuilding itself from the ground up. How Russia, or at least the Duma and Putin, viewed their status in regards to the West. So first, the question we're all asking. When it comes to this whole situation, who's to blame for this? It's Putin. 100%, this was all Putin. Even if NATO had done some bad things, even if Russia had some fair points about their expansion,
that is no excuse to invade your neighbors. Exactly!
Over Ukraine, like Putin says, you still can't invade others. Like, it was bad when the US did it in Iraq. It's even worse when Putin does it now.
Yep.
1991, the fall of the USSR. Russia is weak and wants assurance from the US and NATO that they wouldn't spread east of Germany. Eastern Europe could be like a neutral ground, and the United States informally agreed. Or, well, George H.W. Bush agreed. Verbally.
Bar. We can't show any weakness in front of the Russians.
This was never an actual written agreement. It was just an understanding. Oh, also, I was lying. This agreement wasn't made with Russia after the fall of the USSR, but before, with Gorbachev. The importance of this agreement really depends on who you ask. For avid Russian supporters, this was a legitimate, sometimes legal agreement that NATO promised and then broke. For NATO, their promise not to move east was an informal verbal agreement.
It wasn't written in the contract. It wasn't an agreement at all that was signed in between leaders. It was signed by, it was actually talked about by two military representatives, but it was never ratified into any agreement between the organizations. So, pretty much, nothing had taken place during the time of the USSR and before their dissolution. So, too bad. That's not a valid excuse for them to start invading other countries.
That doesn't matter. Throughout the last century, there have been multiple discussions between NATO and the Russians over their relationship with NATO. The first one, at least of note, was in 1990, where the United States agreed not to move east into East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
But that's a completely different story when the Soviets have lost control. If NATO believes that the Soviets will not lose control of their country, they might keep that agreement into not moving into Germany. But what happened? It all fell apart because of internal issues within the government's cabinet. When that happened, NATO wanted nothing to do with what they first talked about with the USSR, and linked them to the Russian Federation. The Soviet regime is a completely different story than what the Russian Federation is after the fall of the USSR.
The USSR, though weakened, was still a prominent power, and NATO verbally agreed that they would never move in to Germany. And then the Soviets collapsed. Now, when talking about how important these promises were to the Soviets, we will never really know. Even Gorbachev flip-flops on how important these assurances actually were.
Yeah, important because Soviets still have a certain relationship with NATO, but it was all falling apart fast. Of course, it would turn out that way.
What's more interesting is the constant mention of the CSCE. Never heard of it? It's because it never really panned out like it was truly planned. Whether or not any of this was true or just bluster, this talk of a united umbrella was seen as a viable possibility in the early 90s, before the USSR even fell. This is what Gorbachev and the Russians heard. Russia, at least if the Soviets fell, would be joining a united Europe. And then Clinton was elected. It's 1992, baby. The Soviets are dead. Bush, despite overseeing the fall of the Soviet Union and bombing Saddam's forces back into Iraq, still promised to not raise taxes.
Read my lip.
And then he raised taxes.
Oh my God.
So he was voted out. NATO was seen as a relic of an age that no longer existed. It was an active discussion in the 90s what the fate of NATO should even be. It was a stringently anti-communist alliance that no longer had a communism to fight, and yet NATO stayed. Now, let me take out this big ol' button.
Anti-communist because, you see, NATO was still insecure at that time. Remember that the Tiananmen Square incident happened in the 70s? I'm sure at one point that NATO had taken very brief but serious attention to that issue. And that if it would ever happen to any nation ever again, in which students or anyone who protests against a socialist regime or any regime with a dictatorial leadership, if that certain event would actually happen again, NATO would have to be around. NATO would have to be around to guide nations as to how they would combat this. Of course, China would not be willing to do so because China is not aligned with NATO. They're aligned more with Russia, whether it's the Soviet regime or the now modern named Russian Federation. So, pretty much, you wouldn't expect China to back down from its communist regime. Of course they wouldn't. They're going to keep the name. They're going to keep the name the People's Republic of China for years to come because of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping can go right up my ass. Yeah. Yeah, he can do that. Maybe I can consider actually China. Maybe actually I can consider China being a friend. But no, China can kiss it. Really, kiss my ass, China. People's Republic of China. You don't know me. I don't know you. I don't want to know you. I don't care about you. You stay the hell away from me.
Anti-communist alliance that no longer had a communism to fight.
You see, that's the thing. Even if, by the way, as well, even if the USSR is gone, Russia is still around, there are still loyalists to the Soviet regime that NATO does not know about, and that might be the reason why NATO is sticking around, because they want to flush out every single one of these Soviet loyalists, so that if there is no trace of the Soviet loyalty, if there's no leftovers of Soviet loyalty, NATO would have to really dissolve. But they didn't, and it's for good reason. Putin is around. That's a very big red flag when they've known about his background. If he is a USSR spy, like NATO really claims, and it's actually legitimate, then I'm going to tell you, NATO has a good reason to stick around, because the time of the USSR, of course, when he's loyal, it's not over.
And yet NATO stayed. Now, let me take out this big ol' button.
That's true. What Putin has said about the reasons for invading Ukraine, it's all invalidated. He is a liar. He does not tell the truth. He lies about the reasons why Russia is going to war against Ukraine. And everything he stands for is invalidated. Invalidated, but he went on it anyway. His reputation is going to sink down deeper than the Marianas Trench. He will not be able to recover from it. And if he does recover, he's going to have to expect protesters to come at him. Really, I'm sure that's going to happen because Russia is not going to stop. Russia's people, they're not going to stop getting angry at Putin for what he's doing.
I should iterate that the Russians are not simply victims in this. For Central Europe, nations like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and even other nations like the Baltic states were living under Soviet control for decades.
Yeah.
As soon as the Warsaw Pact fell, there was a real homegrown movement to join NATO.
And this is one of the other factors as to why Putin is angry at NATO. NATO is enlisting former Soviet states. That's another invalid reason as to that Putin is making as to why NATO is expanding without means by international law. NATO has a right to. They got to contain and flush out communism, and that's exactly what they're going to do. I'm sorry, Putin, but you are a communist dog. You've always been a communist dog. You've always been a loyalist to the communist regime. Sorry, Putin, but we don't believe a single word you're saying. We don't really believe that.
Protection living under Soviet control for decades. As soon as the Warsaw Pact fell, there was a real homegrown movement to join NATO, or at least get some protection from the West in case anything happened again.
Yeah.
Would anything happen again? Who knows? The West didn't know, the Russians didn't know, and this was kind of the basis of Clinton sort of keeping NATO around. We're into 1993. Russia is slowly rebuilding, with a few hiccups along the way. Clinton comes to Boris Yeltsin with a proposal, a partnership for peace.
Yeah.
All of Europe now coming together. Nobody would need to expand NATO if we all were just in this partnership together. And then Clinton drops the bombshell on Yeltsin. This whole partnership for peace was not an alternative to the expansion of NATO. It was a preparation for it. To which Yeltsin replied, "Why? NATO was created in Cold War times. Today it's trying to find its place in Europe, not without difficulty. It's important that this search not create new divisions, but promote European unity. We believe that the plans of expanding NATO are contrary to this logic. Why sow the seeds of distrust? After all, we're no longer adversaries. We are partners." Yet the plans continued. Poland, Hungary, and Czechia soon joined NATO. Yet this wasn't the breaking point in relations. Russia still remained a part of the NATO cooperation sphere. There was an optimistic view that the kinks in this whole thing were slowly being worked out. Now, keep in mind, this whole time, NATO is entirely justified in...
So, a cooperation has actually been established. I did not know that. I did not know at all. So, Russia was still struggling to keep itself afloat and at the same time keep a positive relationship with NATO. Okay, sure. So they were trying, but they were not trying hard enough. Well, it's understandable. There were still communist loyalists within Russia. I think we're going to have to understand that NATO is insecure, but it's all for good reason.
Technical view that the kinks in this whole thing were slowly being worked out. Now, Keep in mind, this whole time, NATO is entirely justified in what they're doing. They're technically not doing anything wrong.
True.
But from the Russian mindset, going from a communist superpower to a mafia state, where this man is their leader, well, they felt nothing but shame. That fear and paranoia only began to grow, and it became manifested when this guy came to power. But even with Putin in office, and him winning the presidency through some zany means, Russia was still somewhat friendly with the US, yet that was going to change. In 2004, NATO, under Bush's push, brought in 7 new nations.
Yep.
Now, once again, if these nations wanted to join NATO, that's fine. But after a decade of this, Russia became paranoid that NATO was simply out to get them. And then Bush welcomes in these nations as escaping an evil empire.
The door to NATO will remain open until the whole of Europe is united in freedom and in peace.
You can even go back to articles in 2004 where people say Russia is going to change their foreign policy. The Russian Duma began freaking out, and the first man they ran to was a violent Putin. Georgia was invaded 4 years later. Keep in mind when I say Russian.
Yeah, let's not forget Georgia. Let's also not forget 2014, in which they took Crimea! That is not justification for what NATO is doing! They really don't understand that there are still communist loyalists within the Russian influential sphere, huh? Really never really understood that time. They're really just stating the propaganda to the people repeatedly. And anyone who goes against Russia's words is gonna get the guillotine. Well, if not guillotine, a chemical attack. And if not a chemical attack, well, they'll just make you disappear without any further objections from the opposition. Yeah, pretty much.
I don't mean all Russians. I mean the Russian government.
Yeah.
Which should usually be clear, but I just know some of you are going to try to use that as a gotcha. One question may be on your mind. After the Cold War, why didn't the Russians just join NATO if they were so afraid of it? General opposition to the West, for one. Russia, even while the USSR was collapsing, didn't want to view this as a defeat. They wanted to view this as a new age. Then it
No. All you had to do was join the Global Defense Initiative. Wait. Hold on. That's Command and Conquer. Okay, never mind. Completely different story.
turns out only their institutions fell. But there's also another reason why Russia didn't join. NATO is not simply an alliance, it's a structured machine. When a nation joins NATO, it is not simply changing to the blue team. The way its military is organized becomes based around being able to work within that machine. A country joining NATO is a process that takes years. This isn't a process that simply happens. For one, a nation joining NATO has to be unanimously accepted by everyone. And it also has to be voted on by that nation's population. As an example, Hungary in 1997 voted 85% in favor of joining. Would the Russian people ever have accepted to join an organization that they believed was an arm of the American empire?
Look. Let's just be clear. America is not an empire. Never was. It has its own flaws. It even had its own economical crisis back then. But it is not an empire. I can tell you that. It has been reformed into something that the British had made. Well, the British, fine, we can thank them, but they were actually forcing themselves on on the throats of Americans, doing that forcefully until a rebellion had started, and of course it turned into a legitimate war between America and Britain. Do not forget, America stood on its own, even if it had its own mistakes. The people had their own mistakes, but it never turned into an empire. That is something that Russians really don't understand. That is something the general populace of Russia does not understand.
The rule of geopolitics is the closer you are to a superpower, the more they mingle and try to control your nation. And that's what Russia really views a lot of their neighbors as.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't work that way. If the times are changing, so does their way of communication. And if their way of communication improves with over vast distances, it will be a completely different story in geopolitics. As soon as the telephone was made, communication lines started being established. First, national and region. In the national means, then by cross-continental means later on. Okay, hold on. National means, international means, and then cross-continental means. It changed drastically after technology had allowed people to contact people from other countries instantly. And we're now here, year 2022, doing the best we could to actually keep peace above everything else. That's actually the goal, and it has always been the goal. Except Russia has given us the atmosphere that it would turn into a World War III type of period because Putin, he could kiss my ass.
Just pawns on a board for which they, as the stronger nation, have the right to control. Their goals in Europe simply drive others away from them. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. NATO expansion closer to Russia only made them more paranoid and isolated. However, if NATO didn't expand, who's to say what countries like Estonia might find themselves in right now? It's clear Putin has some fantasy about rebuilding the Russian Empire.
Red Alert 2! Yes! Thanks, man! Wow. You're cultured, alternate history. I'll give you that. Nice.
To say what countries like Estonia might find themselves in right now. It's clear Putin has some fantasy about rebuilding the Russian Empire, or at least the influence of the USSR. This video is not about two equally bad camps. NATO's greatest sin, at least in this regard, is leaving its doors wide open. It's been said that Americans should imagine what it'd be like if Canada fell to Chinese influence. Complaining that your geopolitical rival lied about letting your former allies into their compass club doesn't make you look like a victim. Nobody would feel sorry for the United States if China took Canada. They would laugh. Oh wait, actually we don't need a hypothetical. The same situation happened with the US too, with Cuba. And we know how the US would react when a neighbor turns to the enemy's side. Keep them sanctioned for decades, which, here's a little tip, is a bad thing to do too. Whataboutism is used a lot by pro-Putin supporters, bringing up every transgression the US has ever done. And it's true the United States has done a lot of bad things. Iraq, for instance, that was bad.
Sure.
It's funny it's being used as an equivalent because people in the West at the time protested the war without disappearing. The closest the US had to censoring opposition to the Iraq war was when the country industry killed off the Dixie Chick's career. Can Russians today say the same thing? Or are they not even allowed to call this a war but a military operation? That said, we should be asking some questions to ourselves. Did NATO still need to exist after the Soviets fell? Did NATO existing push Russia towards a nationalistic paranoia in its reforming years that undermined the same liberal democracy that the West was trying to plant within the country? Was NATO obligated to give Russian interests the time of day? Do geopolitics even work like that? For my personal opinion, I believe that the Russians had far different expectations for what a post-Soviet world would look like. The Russians believed, in part, because of those 1990 talks involving East Germany.
But they change completely when a regime dissolves it on itself. It's a completely different story. They didn't understand how the times should change for them. Of course, they were not prepared. That's something we cannot blame on them either. I just wish they had an open mind on this.
That with the end of the Warsaw Pact, NATO wouldn't expand. that instead there would be some coalition in Europe where Russia has special privileges. While to the Americans, they took the fall of the USSR as a victory. Their promises to the Soviets were when the Warsaw Pact still existed. With the collapse, the Americans now oversaw a Central and Eastern Europe that was eager to join in the economic prosperity of the West. It was a complicated act balancing these nations while also trying to not exclude the Russians. A Europe that Russia claimed it wanted to be in, yet Russia only became more and more isolated. While much of this discussion is around NATO, this is simply one element. NATO, up until recent events, didn't actually move their military equipment past those original 1991 borders. The main issue the Russian government has isn't just a military bloc, but Western institutions, or at least institutions that don't serve their interests.
Yeah, pretty much. Anything that doesn't benefit Russia is useless to them, of course.
If Putin wasn't blaming NATO, the problem would be something else. Like, I don't know, the whole thing that started this in the first place. Like Ukrainians wanting to join the European Union. Putin's Russia really has been their own worst enemy for a while, as every hostile action, every threat, every influence, every corrupt politician has only made their former allies turn against them. It's always good to try to see from every hostile action, every threat, every influence, every corrupt politician has only made their former allies turn against them. It's always good to try to see from
anything so bad that Russia does. If it's bad for former Soviet nations back then, yeah, pretty much. They will turn against Russia. That's understandable there.
All perspectives. Yet not all perspectives are equal. Sometimes the perspective is simply that another nation was a mistake to exist. Sometimes it's that the collapse of the USSR was the most catastrophic event of the 20th century. Even if there was a kernel of truth to the idea that NATO misled the Russians, it does not justify their actions.
Exactly.
Talking about 20th century. Even if there was a kernel of truth to the idea that NATO misled the Russians, it does not justify their actions. Should Putin really be talking about how misleading is bad? Kind of seems like that was their strategy for the last few months. NATO is not a perfect organization. However, if the nations of Europe want to join this club, it should always be their right. Russia expected the continent to remain a neutral ground for their own interests, even after their pact collapsed, and when that didn't happen, they claimed no fair. You do not start wars over verbal agreements that happened before most of your troops were even born. We cannot forget that this all is coming down to a real war within a split nation. A war that, while true has been raging for 8 years, only began because the Russian side didn't have their guy in charge anymore.
Yeah. I mean, the Russian government is only angry at everyone in Ukraine because their guy wasn't able to secure a position, a very solid position, that Russia wants. That is dark statesmanship. That is dark statescraft that we were not expecting at all. And then Russia, well, led by Putin that time, took Crimea in retaliation. Direct retaliation. Of course people would be angry at the leaders. Of course people would be angry at the Russian government. Come on! Weren't they expecting to be handed a silver platter for respect for being Russia? They're big idiots, aren't they?
One that escalated into an invasion of an independent nation, which regardless of the justification, only justifies the fears of Russia's enemies. So, yeah, congrats Putin. You were the monster that proved NATO was right to build up. While this alliance didn't know what it was going to be in the mid-90s, it sure does know now. You didn't want to be a part of Europe, and now you get your wish.
Take that, Putin! You've been removed from the international banking system. SWIFT Seriously, the only one who can help you is China right now. And if China does help you, either financially or militarily, they get the same sanctions you did, Putin. So you're bringing 2 nations down instead of 1. Well done, NATO. You did it. I love this. Woo-wee. Oh my god. It has become real, folks. It has become very, very real. So, pretty much what have we learned about this today? Pretty much Ukraine is in danger because of past grudges. And yeah, I believe they are past grudges. Past grudges that they didn't need a resolution to, because Russia says there needs to be a resolution. Well, a resolution in which they prefer invasion. That's not an excuse to everything that they think the reasons are for seeing NATO as a direct threat to them, even if NATO is not really doing anything against the Russian Federation. So pretty much everything related to Russia's paranoia, well, it's just paranoia. I can tell you that, very much. Yeah, I'm gonna say this. It's pretty amazing that they're still thinking that NATO is the baddie when they don't realize that even if the USSR was something, it was not it was not of economical significance. They were always going to fall. They just didn't know it. Pretty much. So that said, what is Putin going on all about right now? I mean, yeah, really. I mean, seriously, if Putin had many people actually much more loyal to him than before, then why are even captured soldiers not liking it when it comes to them being captured? Because they're probably not being, they're being mistreated. Well, they're being mistreated in the military. That's how it is. But I'm sure other than that, we can agree. We can definitely agree that I think they turned against Putin because they were really not knowledgeable on what to really do, besides just go into Ukraine and have Ukraine surrender to them. Like that's ever going to be simple. Putin thinks it's going to be simple, like it's a real military operation that would actually go their way. Well, it's not going their way.
When will Russians understand that our commander-in-chief has been a liar? He didn't only tell lies to us.
Ну и всю Россию.
He told lies to the whole Russia.
Yeah. Yeah. True. All the Russian military has to do is get common sense into their minds and think if their actions against Ukraine really mattered, because all of it did not. It should not, because Putin is manipulating them. That is real.
Народа.
I'd like to again sincerely ask the whole Ukrainian people for forgiveness.
Yep.
Против мирного населения.
Hold on. Let me see if my input is actually good. It is. There's nothing wrong with it. Okay.
All mothers, please call your children who are in the military and ask them to return to Russia and not to commit any crimes against innocent civilians.
That's true. I bet the rest of the Russian military did not care for any civilian lives after all. Well, civilians who turned into combatants, of course, it's understandable, but still, there are way too many civilian casualties without guns who are still in danger, still being evacuated. But of course, the military of Russia does not care. At least for the most of it. And this is just to drive the point. What Putin was doing the entire time in Ukraine, everything that he stands for, everything that he believes it is all for, is wrong. All wrong. When will he understand that? He probably never will. He probably never will relent to it because he is a loyal spy for the USSR. And if he's a spy, he would not give an inch to any adversary. Pretty much. Statescraft, his thing, but now he is losing to his own influence. He is losing to his own, let's say, system of intimidation. His own system of intimidation. Game over, Putin. You're not going to last 2022 for long. By the way, thank God I actually finished with this video. Just gonna tell you guys, I'm making my second promotional video. I'm sorry if I sound a little I gotta do this more. I have got to be sorry, I got a lot on my mind recently. Anyway, but I will be releasing this second promotional video this week. Sorry, but there was a bit of a delay. There is actually a delay, a long delay, because I couldn't get the scenes together, and I'm doing this alone, of course. Don't want to pay anyone. I'm trying to save. But anyways, this is EliteLenny signing out. Thank you guys for watching this. This is a reaction that I was hoping that would get people to be aware. Ukraine is under siege by a military that does not do civilians any honor by letting these civilians escape. Well, of course, they don't have these civilians don't have guns, but the Russian military still don't care. And of course, thank you very much for watching me react to alternate history hubs. Did NATO really betray Russia? Well, at some point, NATO may have, but there's actually a good reason. They were talking to the USSR, not the Russian Federation. It's a completely different story from there. It's a completely different story after the dissolution. That much is true. Anyways, this is EliteLenny signing out. Thank you guys, and I will see you guys on the next one. Cheers.